Well, thank you very much indeed, David. And it's my honor and pleasure to be hosting together with you, Professor Itamar Rabinovich, who does not need to be introduced, but however, I'll say a few words both about himself and about his new book. Professor Rabinovich is a professor emeritus of Middle Eastern history at Tel Aviv University. He's also Israel's former ambassador to the United States and former chief negotiator with Syria in the mid-1990s, and the former president of Tel Aviv University between 1999 and 2007. So he was technically my boss during that period. He's also the president emeritus and counselor of the Israel Institute and a distinguished fellow of the Brookings Institution's Foreign Policy program, a very prolific writer. His latest book, which we'll be discussing today, is Middle Eastern Maze, which is, of course, a insider's analysis of the Arab-Israeli conflict and of the peace process. It's, if I understand well, an updated version of a book he published in 2012, The Lingering Conflict. And this new book offers a unique narrative of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the peace process by a senior historian who, as I said, has served as Israel's ambassador to the United States. So I think, Professor Rabinovich, that, of course, it's a very, even though, as David reminded us before, as we're talking in terms of, Israeli politics, the dominant topic right now, of course, is the judicial overall, the controversy around it. And I would say that in recent years, even though Israel has had many elections in the past 3 years, the Arab-Israeli conflict is, I would argue, much less central in the Israeli political debate than it was 20 or even 30 years ago. And yet, of course, just because it is less central in the political debate, and even though there have been some major change in the past 2 years with the Abraham Accords, it has not been solved yet, definitely with the Palestinians. And the question is, do you feel, maybe we'll start with this, maybe can you give us a general introduction about your book, about your main points, about this new version of your book, and tell us more about how do you see, I wouldn't say a solution at this point, but a possible way out of the deadlocked situation between Israel and the Palestinians, especially given the political context, both in Israel and in the Palestinian Authority. Given your experience, your expertise, and your experience, do you see any possible way out of the current deadlock? And if yes, in what direction?
Thank you, Emmanuel. Let me first present the book. This is what it looks like in English. Been published in Hebrew in November and actually was released yesterday by Brookings Press in English and is available on Amazon. Now, this actually is not the second incarnation, but the third incarnation of a book I first wrote when I came back from Washington. I decided to write 2 books, one on my own negotiations with Syria, and one was an overview of Arab-Israeli relations and the peace process, published in 1998. In 2012, so much has happened that I decided to write another, not just an update, but a book predicated on the first version. And I called it The Lingering Conflict because one of the aspects of the Arab-Israeli conflict is that when you think that you have resolved something, you find out that there is something new. If you conclude with Arab states, there is the Palestinians. If you conclude with the Palestinians, you need to deal with the Israeli Arabs. So it was a rather pessimistic view. I called it the lingering conflict. This was 11 years ago, and during these 11 years, again, much has happened, and I thought it was time to write another book. I did it with Brookings, the institution published the 2012 version. And what I've tried to do in the book was to combine a narrative beginning in 1948 and taking us to the present with analytical chapters. One is called Peace and Normalization, and it presents and analyzes the view of peace both by Arabs and by Israelis. And the second looks at the different conflicts between Israel and every actor in the Arab world and in the region. The argument here is that there is not a single Arab-Israeli conflict, but subsumed is a series
I think
of
he's going to be training at Boston.
bilateral conflicts between Israel, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, and so forth. And so one of the new elements in the current in the new book is a shift of emphasis from Arab Israeli to the region, because one of my arguments is that today the Iranian-Israeli conflict has overshadowed the Arab-Israeli conflict. Israel faces greater danger from Iran than it faces from the Arabs, and the Israeli-Iranian conflict in Syria, and by proxy in Lebanon and Gaza and other places, I think predominates. So that is one major point. Now, and I'm sure we will have time to get to speak about other issues such as the Abraham Accords and what they mean for the conflict and so forth. But I would like to respond directly to your question. I think the way out, and it's not imminent, I should emphasize, would be, I think, a unilateral Israeli action.
It's fine.
I doubt.
Thank you.
We will find a partner on the Palestinian side that would be ready to discuss seriously and would have the political power to make the concessions they will have to make in order to come to a mutually acceptable agreement. And therefore, if Israel does not want to be stuck in a quagmire, it will have to take action by itself and try to at least to begin a process of getting out of the present predicament.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Maybe I'll continue on what you just said, the issue of unilateral action, because the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is often has been described as a trilemma or catch-22. On the one hand, there are all the potential dangers of withdrawals. On the other hand, there's the danger of the demographic threat, as it's called. And of course, in the absence of partners on both sides, so the idea which you just suggested of unilateral actions was suggested in the past, and in fact was implemented in a way with the unilateral withdrawal in 2005 from the Gaza Strip and from forced settlements in the West Bank. But of course, because of the precedent of this unilateral action and the fact that the Gaza Strip was taken over by Hamas, which has used the territory which was from which the IDF withdrew in 2005 to launch rockets at Israel. The question is, how do you, so to speak, sell such a strategy to the Israeli public in light of this precedent, which cannot be ignored?
Yeah, very good question. Actually, unilateralism doesn't have a very good reputation in Israel, and opponents of such move cite both the Gaza example and the Lebanon example, the Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon, conducted a few years earlier by Ehud Barak. So, what I normally do when I'm debating with someone who raises these issues, I say, would you like to go back? I've yet to meet the person who would say, yes, I'd like to go back into Gaza, or I'd like to go back into Lebanon. Now, with regard to Gaza, the problem, as you alluded to in your own question, or the way you formulated it, was the the fact that President Bush at the time leaned heavily on Israel to allow a Palestinian election, it had to do with the American invasion of Iraq, his need to show that it brought democracy to the Middle East, and the Palestinian arena was to be one display of parliamentary democracy. And of course, what the elections did is they resulted in a victory by Hamas and Hamas takeover of the Gaza Strip. And of course, we now have a hostile Gaza. But the silver lining is that we don't have several thousand Israeli settlers living in Gaza that would have need to be protected. I mean, the takeover of Gaza would have taken place whether the Israeli settlements were there or were not there. It was a domestic, internal Palestinian issue. So we can now deal with Gaza in pure military terms. We don't have to think about the welfare of several thousand Israeli settlers. But the issue is there, and I should say, parenthetically, it is actually now part of the domestic strife in Israel, because part of the government, people represented particularly by Minister Smotrich, who represent the radical part of the settler movement, in a way are saying this is our revenge for what you did, quote unquote, to us in 2005. So the issues in Israel refuse to go away. And in Lebanon, since 2006, actually after the Second Lebanon War, we have reached a regime of deterrence. There have not been major issues with South Lebanon. What goes on inside Lebanon, where we were not present when we withdrew from Lebanon, is the buildup of a huge arsenal of rockets and missiles. This is the base that Iran created in order to create a deterrence against Israel, against a potential attack on their nuclear installations. And this is one of the 2 or 3 most ominous issues that any Israeli government needs to deal with. So I would say, so you have to think or always revisit earlier decisions, but you have to ask yourself, well, what are my options? There's not going to be, at least as Abu Mazen is there, a Palestinian leadership ready to make a deal that we can accept. The United States has David Siegel has already indicated in his opening remarks, is half absent from the Middle East. It is not there to play the role that it had in the past. And our choice is whether we want to stay with the status quo. And the status quo is not static. It's not in place. We are moving towards one statehood if things don't change. And if we want to create a different reality in which we guarantee the Jewish Zionist character of the state, we will have to take unilateral action. Unilateral action doesn't mean full withdrawal. It means that there'll have to be some withdrawal, but we'll have a much better line, and we'll be separated from a large chunk of the Palestinian population.
Right. Maybe very shortly on the question of the dilemmas of unilateralism. The question is also, even if unilateral measures are necessary in order to preserve Israel's Jewish majority and a democratic regime, you mentioned also the unilateral withdrawal from Lebanon, and the question is, in the long term, don't unilateral steps undermine in the long term possible negotiations? Because if you take, for example, the outcome of the unilateral withdrawal from southern Lebanon in 2000, it took place shortly before the Camp David summit in July 2000, And as former Foreign Minister Shlomo Ben Ami recalls in his memoirs, the Arafat himself at Camp David related to Israel's unilateral withdrawal from Lebanon and said basically, why should I negotiate with you guys when Hezbollah obtained much more through unilateral withdrawal? And in his memoirs, Ben Ami says, in a way, this unilateral measure kind of affected our ability to negotiate later on with the Palestinian Authority. Maybe the problem here was of timing. But the question is, if in the long term, we do want with unilateral action to keep the parameters of a possible or potential political solution in the future, is also the question of whether or not unilateral steps don't affect or might not affect in the long term negotiations.
Yes, they might, and of course, every arena is connected to another in our neighborhood. But yes, there was a unilateral withdrawal from Lebanon, but then in 2006, when Hezbollah provoked us, they suffered a huge blow. And Nasrallah himself said that had he known the outcome, he would not have begun. So our deterrence with regard to Lebanon has been restored. I would say in this context, and again, David Siegel referred to it in his introductory comments, we are now engaged, of course, in a suicidal domestic conflict inside Israel. And Arabs are watching at us and are asking themselves whether the Jews decided to destroy themselves. At this point, they have not taken action. But of course, one of the negative outcomes of this domestic development is a decline in our deterrence. And finally, with regard to your question, yes, unilateralism, effective negotiations are preferable to unilateralism if you have somebody to talk to. Hezbollah was never a potential partner to talk to. It's a frontier guard, a front guard of the Iranian Revolution that absolutely refuses to accept Israel and its legitimacy. It's not a partner for negotiations, except, I should say, in brackets, they did agree to the Lebanese-Israeli agreement on demarcating the maritime border because there was a paramount interest on their side to start drilling for gas because Lebanon is in a dire economic situation. But that was not a direct Hezbollah to Israel negotiation.
Right. So maybe I'd like to now zoom out a little bit with the wider Middle East. You have a chapter in your book with an update on the Abraham Accords. And would you agree that in a way, Israel's strategy in the 1960s, which was called the periphery, which has been devised and initiated by Ben-Gurion, was together with the Mossad, which, as you know, consisted of creating a de facto alliance with countries such as Iran and Turkey in order to face both Arab nationalism and Soviet expansionism in the Middle East. Of course, with time, this periphery strategy fell apart because of the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979, and of course, even with Turkey, with the advent of Erdogan in 2002, and in later years, his very confrontational policy vis-a-vis Israel. But would you agree that maybe today this periphery has been kind of turned upside down, where in fact with the normalization with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, the de facto, though still unofficial relation with Saudi Arabia, today there's more kind of I would say almost a periphery with Sunni moderate Arab states in order to better face Iran, but also in a way Turkey, which has become more confrontational, and I'm sure we'll talk later on whether or not Erdogan's overtures toward Israel are sincere or not. But would you also say that, again, based on your expertise of the region and your own experience, there is kind of a periphery of the 60s in reverse today in the Middle East?
Yeah. I think you described very well the orientation on the periphery in the 50s that was devised by Ben-Gurion because we were confronted by a very hostile circle immediately around us, And what he did was he leapfrogged over that circle and created this very effective relationship with Iran, Turkey, and Ethiopia at the time. But that policy ran its course. And actually, in the 1990s, during the peace process of the 1990s, when there was mutual recognition between Israel and Palestinian nationalism, it became easy for Sunni Arab states to negotiate with Israel. They could then tell the Palestinians, well, if you've made a deal with Israel and you recognized Israel as a legitimate state, why can't we do the same? And that opened the way. We had immediately peace with Jordan. We already had peace with Egypt, and we had under the table relationship with several countries in the Gulf. They, at that point, were not interested in moving it from under the table to the top of the table, and it was a development of the past few years that it became legitimate for them to do that. That of course created a situation whereby Israel has a relationship with several Sunni Arab states. There was even an institutionalization of sorts in what was called the Negev Summit, when foreign ministers from Gulf states, Jordan, Egypt were there, and the Secretary of State of the United States, and that indicated that it was a new phase. I should say, I should add now parenthetically that since the establishment of the new Israeli government and the predominance of nationalistic elements in that government, there is a certain slowdown in that process. Two subsequent or two follow-up events to the Negev Summit have been postponed. And I can see that there's a bit of a cold feet phenomenon on the side of the Emirates.
Right. So you're right that, of course, following the Oslo agreements between Israel and the PLO, this made it easier for other Arab countries to potentially normalize with Israel. It became official with Jordan, but on the other hand, with the UAE and with Bahrain, and I would say also in a way with Morocco, even though the Moroccans don't see themselves as technically belonging to the Abraham Accords, but in that case, in 2020, what those countries were saying is that they were willing to normalize with Israel without waiting for a political settlement between Israel and the Palestinians. So this seemed to provide a new type of paradigm. Of course, we also know that at the end of the day, the UAE agreed to normalize because Israel at the time committed not to proceed with the plan of partially annexing at least parts of the West Bank, as had been proposed by the deal of the century designed by Jared Kushner. But as of today, my question to you is, how do you see, how do you understand, how do you explain the recent basically normalization, not between Saudi Arabia and Israel, but between Saudi Arabia and Iran? Do you see that as a tactical move or as a game changer?
No, it is a significant development, and on the whole negative from Israeli and American point of view. But you have the following elements. I mean, obviously Iran was interested. The Saudis are thumping the noses at the Biden administration. There's an enmity that goes back to the Obama administration when Biden was deputy vice president. Obama completely disliked the Saudis and was quite open in expressing his dismissive attitude, to the point where Prince Turki Al Faisal, the important Saudi prince, wrote a famous article calling it "We are not free riders" at Obama. So Biden, particularly, and the whole group that came with him into the administration are not particularly welcome in Saudi Arabia, and they've actually humiliated Biden. He went to Saudi Arabia. He tried to get them to lower the price of oil, to increase production, and they, of course, did the opposite, trying to indicate that they are independent players, developing also a relationship with Russia, not following the American line on Ukraine, and now, of course, using China as a mediator between themselves and Iran. So I would see this development primarily belonging to the realm of Saudi-American relationship and the need for the United States to ask itself whether it is not losing too much ground in the Middle East, but Israel is not a beneficiary of what happened.
So here's an intriguing question. You mentioned China and Saudi Arabia. So first of all, as you mentioned, President Biden did try to change course when it comes to his administration attitude towards Saudi Arabia, because as you mentioned, he flew to Riyadh and he basically said to MBS, I'm willing to revert to realpolitik because of the war in Ukraine. We need Saudi oil. Let's forget about what MBS did to the, in Turkey to the Saudi journalist a few years ago, this murder and a horrible way of getting rid of him. And as you said, the Saudis were not impressed. They were not willing to play ball. And like many other countries, they play sometimes the Chinese against the Americans. But on the other hand, since China has been, basically cooperating with Iran to bypass US sanctions, has signed a cooperation agreement with Iran. And at the end of the day, the national security of Saudi Arabia depends on the United States, on the US Army. The Chinese are never going to come to the defense of Saudi Arabia. So how do you explain, don't you think that the Saudis are bluffing? Because obviously they're not going to rely on China for the security.
Yeah, they are toying, I would say, maybe not long, but toying with their national security. They think they have some leeway. And you have to remember the person who makes the decision is MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the heir apparent, and he's a young man who is very bold and sometimes a bit rash. He cannot understand Saudi policy without this personal dimension. So maybe it's a risk that his predecessors would not have taken. He's taking that risk.
Right. So do you think also, and this brings me to maybe more the domestic situation in Israel, in your understanding, this decision by MBS to kind of officialize his relations now with Iran, do you think there's any connection with the way Israel is perceived by him and in the region in light of the internal turmoil? The incoming government in Israel, and the Prime Minister Netanyahu had said a few months ago with his new government that one of his priorities was to expand the Abraham Accords and to normalize with Saudi Arabia. By the way, nowhere did he mention the judicial overhaul in his government's priorities. But then the main action of the government, instead of working on normalization with Saudi Arabia, was the judicial overhaul. Do you think that the consequences of this judicial overhaul and how it's splitting Israeli society apart, do you think it had an impact on MBS's decision with regard to Iran?
No, I don't think so. I think he decided that since he cannot fully rely on the United States, maybe if things came to a crunch and the future of Saudi Arabia, the regime, would have been at stake, maybe at that point the United States would come to his aid. But in the context of daily business, Saudi Arabia was attacked. The oil installations were attacked by the Saudis. There was no American response. The Iranians shot down an American drone, a very sophisticated drone. This was all under Trump. and Trump ultimately decided not to respond. So, yeah, and the Saudis remember what was the fate of Mubarak, who had been a loyal American ally for so many years, and when there was a domestic revolt against him, the Americans politely or not so politely asked him to leave. So they feel that they have to broaden the field, and that they need relationships with others as well, and also take a dig at the Americans, remind them that they should take Saudi interests and wishes into account more effectively and more expeditiously. So that's one issue. The other is how the Saudis look at us. I frankly don't think that the hope of the Israeli government at this time to reach peace and normalization with Saudi Arabia is very realistic. We have a nationalist or nationalistic Israeli government with a very strong hand vis-a-vis the Palestinians. There are clashes in the West Bank. There are clashes over the Temple Mount. This is not the kind of mood that would lead the Saudis to do that. And they have the best of what they want in their relationship anyway, what they want to buy from us, or where they want to collaborate with us. They do it under the table. They've done it for a long time. And from their point of view, they can continue to do so. I would say, in terms of the Saudi comments on events that have taken place recently in Israel or between Israel and the Palestinians, they've been much sharper, sometimes even venomous, as compared to Saudi criticism in earlier years. So I don't think it seems to be on the way to any normalization.
Okay, as you know, also the head of Hezbollah in Lebanon, Nasrallah, did mention recently that he saw in the turmoil in Israel a very positive sign. As you know, he had used the image of a spider web a few years ago, saying that Israeli society would just fall apart like a spider web. And recently, he basically cheered over the social and political turmoil in Israel. Do you think in the case of Nasrallah, even though, as you mentioned before, it does look indeed like Hezbollah has been deterred since the Second Lebanon War of 2006, and even though he not only is coordinated with Iran, but basically takes his orders from Tehran, do you think that the way he sees closer from Israel, the political turmoil here might have an impact on the way he may make decisions, or the Iranians may make the decisions regarding Israel?
It might, if the crisis in Israel lingers. It's always dangerous to rush to conclusions in the middle of a story. The story is not over yet. There may be a political settlement inside Israel, and things may I hope, may return to normal. And the silver lining for someone like myself, who looks at the events in Israel in the past couple of months, I see a very strong civil society responding to the event. I was surprised by the power and by the willingness of hundreds of thousands of Israelis to mobilize, to express their views, to take matters into their own hands. It's a very involved society. It's actually a very healthy democracy. It is facing a challenge. I'd be the last person to minimize the significance of the challenge, but I'm very much encouraged by what Israeli civil society is projecting.
Thank you. Maybe I would like also to mention, I mean, as I said before, you're also an expert on Syria, Lebanon. You were involved in negotiations in the past between Israel and Syria. And what we have today in Israel's northern border are basically two failed states. Syria, which has been basically destroyed by over a decade of a civil war. Lebanon also, where even though Hezbollah was somehow weakened by the latest round of elections, but it's a very dysfunctional country. How do you see the future of those two countries? Which I'd like to add another point, which is that when it comes to Syria, for example, so of course there is a heavy influence and presence of Russia there, but even Russia, which for many years was perceived by some as a major power, has turned out to be a fake power whose military has revealed itself as being extremely dysfunctional, and also which doesn't have the economic means of rebuilding Syria. I mean, Russia's GDP, as I always say, is basically the size of Spain's GDP, and it also has a population that keeps shrinking and getting smaller. So, given Russia's weaknesses and drawbacks in its war of aggression against Ukraine, how do you see the future of Syria and the consequences of this future on Israel's northern border?
Okay. You asked about Syria and Lebanon. I'll say something about each of them. So you mentioned that Syria and Lebanon are failed states. Actually, it's a symptom of the crisis, the larger crisis in the Arab world, that there are 6 failed states in the Arab world. They are not the only ones. And secondly, it's very interesting that these failed states continue maybe not to function, but to exist. You look at Lebanon, at Syria, at Iraq, at Yemen, Somalia, Libya, and us. How can it go on? Well, it does go on, mostly because the neighbors are not in much better shape. So they somehow continue to move on in this miserable fashion. Now, with regard to Syria, you have a very cynical ruler, Bashar al-Assad, and his family and community. You need to think in terms almost of a mafia state, including the fact that much of the income now comes from drug dealing with drugs. They're a huge exporter of drugs. But they've made a decision. They use a term called essential Syria. Essential Syria is central and western Syria, basically from Damascus to Aleppo and the coast, and of course the Alawite country. And what happens in the east and in the north, it seemed to them as marginal. In the north, let's bear in mind that Turkey has de facto annexed about 6 or 8% of Syria. It's run like a province of Turkey. There is an American presence, not large, but effective. And there are the Kurdish militias in the east and in the northeast of Syria. The regime de facto controlled about 60% of the country. And even in these 60%, this is not a normal way of governance. And, Assad can go on like this. He's not interested in bringing back 5 million refugees. He can live without economic rehabilitation. Cynically used the international aid to the victims of the earthquake in order to draw the resources to himself and to the regime. And since the opposition is exhausted and the world practically lost interest in Syria, he can go on. Now, in Syria, the Russians indeed are a lesser player than they used to be when they first intervened in 2015, and they leave the field very much to Iran. It's sort of, it's a trade-off. Iran helps them in Ukraine with drones and so forth, and they give Iran more leeway in Syria, and it is up to Israel to check the Iranian expansion and digging in Syria. And Lebanon is really in a very sorry state. The strongest actor in the country is Hezbollah. It is stronger than the government. It does not want to take over. It wants power without responsibility, which it has.
Right. So this brings me to my last question, and then we'll take the questions we have from the audience. You mentioned how Russia is letting more leeway to Iran in Syria, and the question is now precisely because of the now the military cooperation between Russia and Iran, the fact that Russia, as we know, has been purchasing Iranian drones, and in a way, Iran is basically to the Middle East what Russia has become to Europe, an aggressive bully. And I think that today with the war in Ukraine, there is a very impressive unified European stance against Russia, maybe with the exception of Hungary. But other than that, both the EU and the UK have shown a lot of resolve and unity against the Russian aggression. As the Russians are cooperating with the Iranians, do you see, because of course FELNET is an organization that deals with relations between Israel and Europe, do you see for Israel and Europe a new way to cooperate in terms of security? Do you see this European alignment, this unity of democracies in the West as a new opportunity for Israel and as a new maybe European role also in the Middle East?
Definitely. I think what has been happening in Ukraine just underlines the point. Iran, I'd say both Iran and Turkey. You mentioned that Russia is actually not such a great power. It's about 140 million with a fairly small GNP. Iran and Turkey are both over 90 million. They are superpowers in Middle Eastern terms, and both of them see themselves as now actors on the international arena. And with massive repercussions from Europe, Iran at this point in Ukraine, but other points maybe elsewhere. Turkey, of course, very disappointed that it has not been admitted into the EU and venting its anger on Europe in a number of ways. It is now delaying the Sweden's participation in NATO. It is using several million Syrian refugees in its territory as a not so veiled threat. And Europe, if you don't please us, we'll release another million Syrians to go to Europe. So these are all major national security issues for Europe. Israel is, I think, a very important partner and potential partner in some fields still not explored. And I think the ground is fertile for expansion and deepening of the Israeli relationship and cooperation with Europe.
Thank you. We have actually now a question from the audience. So let me read it to you. The Saudis request, Saudi Arabia has requested U.S. help in creating a civilian nuclear program as a condition to joining the Abraham Accords. Is this realistic? And what is Israel's response to this?
Yeah, I saw this journalistic report. I'm afraid it's not correct. It doesn't seem to me. It doesn't seem to me like an authentic or authoritative report. It's just, an item in the press that may not be true.
Okay. We have also a question from the audience, another question from the audience, from Norman Lipov. What unilateral steps would you recommend that Israel take, I guess in reference to what you discussed before, in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Okay, and I'll use the opportunity to say hello to my friend Norman in Miami. This is not for now. I mean, to be realistic, we now have a nationalistic government with people like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir in key positions. They are not going to make any concession. Actually, the platform of both the two parties that they represent, it calls for an annexation of the West Bank to Israel. So as long as this government is in power, as well as long as Abu Mazen is in power and the US is half absent, the ground is not ready for any ambitious steps. When circumstances change in Israel, in the region, and with US policy, then Israel could reestablish a relationship with the Palestinian Authority, could make some territorial concessions, consolidate the line, have less Palestinians under its control, do it in coordination with the United States and with its new Arab partners. I would say one of the beneficial, encouraging aspects of the Abraham Accords is that now there is a fairly good relationship between the United Arab Emirates and the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinians first reacted very angrily to the Abraham Accord, and now they understand that this is an established fact and the Emirates are an important player and they have a relationship. So we should find a way of using our relationship with these countries in order to help any move that we make in the future much better. One of the problems, go back to the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, is that it was done unilaterally. It was not done in real coordination with the Palestinian Authority or with the Arab world, and it was one of the reasons that it ended the way it did.